feedback in a vacuum feels very punitive often. So the feedback's got to happen in interaction, where it usually happens in any sort of communicative interaction. So learners don't lose sight that they can use the target language to do what they want to do with it, which is, make friends and explore new places and get jobs. I find that what motivates the change in pedagogy doesn't come from the head, it comes from the heart. And so that is difficult for research because research is very cerebral. What's important is that teachers get to experience the type of language learning environment that they're supposed to be able to create. It can be very face-threatening for both researchers and teachers to talk about what they don't know, because both researchers and teachers in their jobs are people who are supposed to know things. It's so easy as a teacher to walk into a space and say, oh, this researcher just wants to hype up their work and tell me what to do. As a researcher, assume the teacher that raises their hand and asks a question that seems to contradict what you've just said doesn't care about what you do. Assume everyone's there to try to make language learning a more positive and effective event for students.
How can teachers design rubrics that encourage growth, that encourage confidence, instead of just complying?
Building a program that's based around proficiency. You've got middle schoolers who are asking for things like, did I connect my sentences this time? They're not asking like, why didn't I get the 2 points? Why am I not at 100? Designing rubrics around your proficiency goals for your program, I think, is a way of making them a positive, empowering tool instead of something that's punitive.
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Folks, today's guest is Caitlyn Pineault. Caitlyn's always been driven by a very simple question. What is the best way to teach language? What's interesting is that curiosity took her from being a K-12 Spanish teacher to becoming a PhD candidate in applied linguistics at Georgetown University. At Georgetown, she teaches undergraduate courses in second language acquisition and leads professional development that helps bring research and classroom practice closer together. Her work has been published in many journals like the Modern Language Journal and Foreign Language Annals, and she's also the co-founder of a recurring column in the Language Educator called Collective Wisdom, Teachers and Researchers in Dialogue, which basically creates a space for exactly that, more honest conversations between teachers and researchers. And don't forget, if you really enjoy these conversations, subscribe on YouTube and follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us grow the show, help more teachers find us. And of course, today's episode is presented by We Are English Teachers, a place for language teachers seeking more students. And the link, of course, is in the description of the show. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Caitlyn, I would like to start with curiosity. And the reason why I want to start with that word is because when I was reading a little bit about your profile, when I was reading more about your work and what you do, I feel like your story, to a certain extent, encapsulates a lot of the ideas behind the word curiosity. And then for some reason, that kind of took me on a bit of a tangent because I wanted to learn more about the word curiosity. So I'm going to ask both of you, and maybe people who are listening to us, do you guys know anything about where the word curiosity comes from?
I don't. Man, I tried to prepare for this meeting, but I didn't look up the word curiosity.
Like a lot of English words comes all the way from Latin, but one of the things I found out is that it comes from the Latin curiositas, which means not only a desire for knowledge, but also care, concern, attention. And when we think about the adjective curious, we're talking about the root of it is the word cura, which means care. So if we kind of trace it back, curiosity is not just about collecting, gathering information, or perhaps satisfying some sort of idle interest. What I liked about that is that it's about caring enough to notice, caring enough to pay attention, caring enough to stay with something long enough so as to understand it. And I feel like when I was looking at your story and how you went from where you were before to where you are now, I feel like there is a lot of curiosity. There's a lot of caring deeply enough about learning, about teaching, and about language to just keep asking questions. So perhaps we could start there. Can you take us back to when this all began? Was there a specific moment in your classroom when you realized, I want to know more about how languages are acquired, and just as much as what we teach?
Yeah, I really don't think you could have picked a better word for me. Wow, curious is one of my favorite words, and I think I totally see being curious as an act of caring, of what other people know that you don't know, of experiences that you haven't had yet. I think for where my journey on all of this, wondering about how languages are learned, began was actually in my own middle school language classrooms when I was 12, 13 years old. I desperately wanted to learn Spanish. I had a lot of friends who spoke Spanish. I was a good student by all normal measures, but I had a heck of a time following just what we were doing in Spanish class, to the point of, if you were doing a worksheet where you had to circle all the forms of the verb to be, ser, I would read sentences and I would see ella es inteligente. And I'd be like, ES, I'm looking for SER, next. And I do the whole worksheet like that, circle nothing, because of course all the forms of ser would have been conjugated. And I would sit staring at the blackboard wondering what was going to happen next, because I didn't see the verbs there on the worksheet. And so that, I think, encapsulates a lot of my early language learning experiences, were just feeling like I wasn't getting it, but not knowing why. And eventually I did get it, and don't exactly know how it happened. It was a lot of work to get whatever Spanish is in my brain. But I think that really made me wonder, why is language learning so hard? I know I want to do it. I know how to be a good student, but it's just not coming as easily for me as I saw it come from my peers and from my classmates. And so I think that is where the curiosity about language learning started for me. And that has launched me way back when. Just feeling like language learning was not something I could do, but desperately wanting to do it.
I'm curious now, since we're talking about the word curiosity. So you were a school teacher. And then,
I was.
Yeah. And then eventually you shifted from school teacher into the world of applied linguistics and research. What exactly drew into this world? And now that you're teaching and you're researching at Georgetown, but you're still somehow connected to K-12 education. So the question is, what drew into this world, and how, when you think about how these two worlds communicate, how do they talk to each other for you?
Sure. I guess continuing along my journey, I went to undergrad. I didn't know what I wanted to study, but I knew I didn't want to be a language teacher. My mom is a French teacher, so I thought I knew what that life was about and was thinking that something else was in store for me, but got to college, wanted to keep up my hard-earned Spanish, got involved with a program teaching Spanish in the local elementary schools. The schools were pursuing IB status, but in order to have it in the way they wanted it, they needed K-5 language as well, but didn't have the resources or community. They had community sports. That's why there were undergrads in there, but they didn't yet have the means to have a full-time teacher who that was their whole role. So they had a bunch of undergrads teaching. And when I was in that role, I started to realize and learn more about language pedagogy and get my first taste of second language acquisition research. And I then realized that there were lots of ways of teaching languages, and maybe the ways that I had been taught languages just didn't resonate for me at the time, or there are ways in which different methods could be combined to support learners who approach language acquisition from different perspectives based on their individual differences, personality. And so that really made me want to get involved in language teaching, because I wanted students to have experiences that left them feeling more confident in their language abilities than I felt with mine at the time. From there, continued teaching primarily K-12 Spanish, though I did 2 years teaching English, 1 year in Mexico teaching English as a foreign language, and then 1 year back in the US teaching English to speakers of other languages. But the K-12 Spanish has always been my favorite. And in that teacher community, I found so much curiosity. All my colleagues really desperately wanted to do best by their learners, as my middle school and high school teachers wanted to do by me, and were so engaged in the Ohio Foreign Language Teacher Association, ACFL, different associations. Everyone wanted to know what the research said, how they could align their curriculum with research to teach in the best way possible. And that was what motivated me to get my master's in applied linguistics rather than education. I think at the time I had fallen into another number of circumstances where I had been teaching for 8 years. And so getting my master's, I wanted it to be specifically in second language acquisition, and a lot of the ed programs I looked at had 1 or 2 courses in SLA, but I really wanted that to be the focal piece of my studies. So I got to Georgetown, and for my master's, I had the PhD was not on the horizon yet. And I thought I could read some books and figure out what the research said about how languages should be learned and taught, and I go back to the classroom and it would be great. But I got to Georgetown and realized that there was so much going on that I had no idea of. And all the research that I thought I knew from my teacher communities and the professional development was just the tip of the iceberg. And so the 2-year master's program just wasn't enough time. And I was so thrilled to be at Georgetown and find faculty who were deeply committed to strengthening the teaching and learning of languages. And that has been so wonderful. And I saw that there might be a space for me to contribute to this work as well from my background as a K-12 world language teacher. So that's what I've been doing.
That's such an interesting way to frame all of this and to guide us through this entire journey. A couple of things you said that when you said there's so much going on, it was just the tip of the iceberg. And there was like so much research out there, and you have access to this research. You have been reading about it, writing about it, exploring that. And I feel like in one of the pieces that you've written, you said that research should always serve teachers, not intimidate them. I think the question I have for you, and this is something that when we started learning English, we thought a lot about this, is like we wanted to, very similar to the collective wisdom. Yes, collective wisdom. Very similar to the collective wisdom, our idea was to really just try to make research more or less intimidating, as you described them. But what does that look like in practice for you? Like, how can these findings that we have from SLA make their way into the classroom? And perhaps even, what do you think as a teacher, someone who plays in both backgrounds, what is really standing in the way of teachers accessing or even applying research?
Yeah. There's so many directions to take. I think this podcast is one of the ways, and podcasts like this. When my colleague Matt Koss and I were starting Collective Wisdom, there was a lot of interest about taking the conversations we were having and turning them into an accompanying podcast so that the readers of the piece could also be a part of the conversation in that way. But Matt and I don't know very much about podcasts, but we knew enough to be like, we don't have the bandwidth to do both things well. And we also wanted to keep the conversations a place where people felt like they could speak freely and didn't have to feel like they were representing their institutions or their positions, though of course they are, in case the conversation takes more unexpected creative turn. I think it can be very face-threatening for both researchers and teachers to talk about what they don't know, because both researchers and teachers in their jobs are people who are supposed to know things. Right. And so to have the conversations where someone admits that that's not something they know a lot about, or there's a limit to what they know. We felt it important to have those conversations, have a degree of separation from the externally facing audience. But I think that sense of vulnerability there is something that's got to happen from both perspectives, from teacher perspectives and researcher perspectives, to walk into spaces that are shared and talk about the things that teachers know best and things that researchers know best, but then also be open to how those puzzle pieces might fit together and create new ideas that neither party knows everything about, but both are committed to exploring further.
When you say, I like what you said about a sense of vulnerability. And I feel like teachers, in a way, because we are somehow isolated in a classroom and researchers are isolated in their ivory towers, I feel like there's a lot of separation between these two groups. I think when you've mentioned a sense of vulnerability, the thought that immediately occurred to me was, how can both of these groups of people, both researchers and teachers, develop a better sense of how can they be more vulnerable? Because as I said, you're playing in both playgrounds, but how can they be more vulnerable so as to increase the collaboration and the communication between them?
Yeah, I think kind of two directions. One direction is more concrete. One of my answers is more concrete, and the other one is, I think, a little bit more abstract. I think something that is I think if there were to be a space, whether that be a workshop or a session at a conference, maybe a podcast themed episode where you've got researchers and teachers coming to the space but asking the other for help, I think that naturally creates a space where the walls come down a little bit. And I think when people help each other, that makes you feel connected in a way that hopefully can grow into kind of a more bi-directional dialogue than this one directional, like research tells teachers what's best, what to do, to figure out how to do it exactly. Because that's not what we're hoping for either. Yeah. That's not what I'm hoping for. So I think that's my more abstract answer. And in some of my more recent work, including a project I've got going on now, I think professional learning communities are a space where I see that kind of inquisitive spirit coming to life. Because in a PLC, by nature, there's not a prescribed syllabus or curriculum that must be followed, and the PLC can be shaped by the interests of the researchers and the practitioners, and it's very much about figuring out answers together instead of one person has answers, other people do it, and then that group comes back and asks for help, but there's always the person who has the answers who redirects. And I think for in-service teachers, which is the teacher population that I've worked with most closely, I think that's especially important because in-service teachers are experts in their craft. And so creating spaces where those conversations can happen, where you have multiple experts in the room who are experts in different things, but have this shared goal. And oftentimes I've found, both as an in-service teacher, when that was my primary role, and also as a facilitator who, when I'm facilitating, oftentimes I'm seen more as the researcher expert, maybe by some people. That is a place where it feels like one person's expertise is being prioritized and recognized more than other people's expertise. And so I think any sort of setting where there is space for everyone's expertise to actually be heard and recognized. I feel like I hear a lot of times in teacher education spaces, and I've done this to language students, I'm sure I've said this in teacher ed spaces as well, where I've shared something and there is a teacher that raises their hand and has a very relevant, either like exception or really specific example where whatever I've said doesn't translate and they're letting me know. And I've said, you're the expert in your own context. Make of it what you will. And sometimes I say that because I don't have time to get into it, or I'm not sure the best way, and I need to preserve my role as the lead facilitator guiding us through the next several hours. But I've always felt like that response takes away opportunities where I can learn about that classroom context. I know about some classroom contexts, but not all classroom contexts. And classrooms change so much, especially now with more and more technology at teachers and students' disposal, that as well.
I was just going to add, that's a good example, I think. We hear that
I'm glad you're going to talk about that.
Lot, Leo,
but
right?
in my classroom,
which
I
is
teach,
fine. Which is, we can't know all context, but I want to focus on the word help, Caitlyn, because you mentioned that both parties, a lot of researchers, the ones that we talk to, are teachers and researchers, right? So you use primary role, which I think is a nice distinction for this, because I think there's this assumption that researchers are just researchers and they don't teach. And I guess there are some like that, but most people that we've interviewed on this show do both. So they're teaching and researching. With that help dichotomy of, okay, maybe some teachers don't have access to research or they're not aware of all of it, and that's the help that maybe can be transmitted, or the knowledge that can be transmitted to the teacher from the researcher. What do researchers need help with? How do teachers, or what, you have a couple of examples to share of how we as teachers can help you, the research community?
Yeah. Oh gosh, just like what to research. What do you see? We have like research, like people have got good ideas, like phenomenal ideas, of course, but it's so easy to have a research agenda, and then that agenda takes its own twists and turns. And in those twists and turns, when you follow any rabbit hole, like it gets distant from something, and that something might be the class, like a specific classroom context. So I think just what are the issues that you care about, that you're seeing is relevant to your student? If theories of second language acquisition are supposed to be able to shed light on how people acquire languages, and within instructed second language acquisition, it's how people get new language in an instructed context. The researchers can't know every single instructed context. They might not know all the different learner profiles in the classroom. So they can learn from the teachers, okay, what are the instructed contexts? What are the variables that are really interesting? I did a study, I think this isn't a study where I collected the data 2 years ago. It's in press now, but I facilitated these reading sessions around the OASIS summaries.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with the OASIS database. And the conversations that I had with these teachers were just phenomenal. And I wish I had recorded them all. I didn't. The teachers were doing journals for me.
So wait a second. The teachers
Sure.
were reading the OASIS summaries of the research, and then they were having like a dialogue.
Not with the researchers, just with each other.
Just with each other
me.
about what the research was suggesting. And
Yeah.
you recorded that.
So they did journal entries.
Okay.
So we had conversations, and they wrote journal entries after they read what they were thinking. Did they understand? Was this helpful? Were there any new ideas or perspectives? Was everything feel like old news? But one of my favorite parts of the journal entries were the questions that teachers left. And I jotted down 2 of them just in case this came up. But one of them was, do multilingual learners or English language learners perceive recasts in their core subject areas in the same way that my second language learners perceive them in my language classes? I was like, that's so cool.
That is a very good
And maybe
question.
there's research that's looked in that area, but I'm sure it could be narrowed down to specific grade levels and program types. But that sort of bridging of what language learning looks like for students in a middle school who have different language learning backgrounds, and some of them take their core classes in their first language and others don't, but to what extent are their language learning experiences similar or not?
Yeah.
Another one was, how can I provide feedback that targets morphosyntactic issues to my students in ways that they can perceive and notice, but not distract from our communicative goals?
Oh.
Great
What a
one.
great thing to research. And again,
Yes.
like, there is research that has looked at the provision of feedback and what that does to what students notice. But I could see those studies, like, methodologically being tailored to fit in a middle school setting or a high school setting, because most research has been done in university settings with English or Romance languages. I think there's a lot to look at with primary and secondary learners.
I've been talking to a lot of freelance teachers lately, as I do every day. And the one thing I keep hearing is how frustrating big platforms can be. We all know who they are. The low rates, the commissions, the algorithms, the lack of control. And in some cases, even having teachers work against each other. But working together, Abby, is how you and I met. And if you don't know, this is Abigail Fulbrook, the founder of weareenglishteachers.com. Abby, can you tell us what makes weareenglishteachers.com different?
Oh, yes. Of course, I designed We Are English Teachers for independent teachers who want to find students in their own way. So learners come to the site, they can search for teachers or courses and contact the teachers directly for free. There's no commission, there's no fee to contact the teachers. And the teachers, you can set your own prices, you manage your payments, you manage your calendar, and you keep every dollar that you earn.
I love that. It's really about taking back control of your teaching and of your own business.
That's it, exactly. And it's a membership as well as being a member and being listed in the directory. You get access to our community. It's called Elevate, and that has workshops, accountability, it has meetups and support from other independent teachers. So you get to meet people who are growing real businesses as well.
Incredible. I love this so much. So if you're listening and you're an independent teacher and you want to move away from those platforms that we mentioned, you want to get help finding, securing, and keeping your next English students and clients, go to the website weareenglishteachers.com. and join Elevate today. That's weareenglishteachers.com. Abby, thank you for this.
Thank you.
We're going to say this, but I don't know if you're familiar with Karen Lickman and her work. We just spoke to her a few months ago, and she's the first person that comes to mind with young learners because she researched many things, but among our young learners, better learners than adults, and how do kids basically acquire additional languages. It's fascinating, that conversation as well.
It is, and I think that's something that a lot of the teachers would read. I had intentionally tried to select a variety of OASIS summaries that captured different types of participants in different classroom. But when teachers were reading summaries of studies, that's seminal work in the field of SLA, but if they were done with English language learners who were 24, and it was being read by a middle school teacher who teaches Arabic, they were like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to get from this. And I was like, fair. I don't think the researcher would tell you that anything about this study necessarily is for you.
Yeah.
But then what is for you? What about this could be relevant, or do you encounter in your classroom? And how can we work together to formulate some questions that we're both interested in?
I really like this idea.
Before Leo jumps in, just for anyone listening who doesn't know or is not familiar with OASIS, OASIS is an open access database, I guess is the best word for it, for journal articles. One of the hurdles for teachers getting access to the research is actually the paywalls. It's actually literally getting access to it. So OASIS does a wonderful job. Yeah. I'm not intimately familiar with it, but I know of it. But they basically have summaries, Caitlin, if I'm not correct, of articles that are open access and free for anyone to read. Yes?
Yeah, I think they've got about 1,300 now, and they are formatted in bulleted lists for skimmability, and you've segmented out the main sections of a research article. So that was something these teachers commented on. A lot of the details of the statistical analyses, teachers were like, that's not something I'm interested in or equipped to evaluate. Just tell me what you did and what you found, and I'll see how that fits with what I'm interested in.
Yeah. No, actually, I think the idea of reading OASIS and having teachers just having a conversation about what's relevant here in this research to my classroom, to my context, to my learners, I think that's a phenomenal idea. If I'm not mistaken, Andrew, I think Richard Chin did something similar when he was teaching a CELTA course in the UK. He would have his pre-service teachers actually reading summaries from OASIS and doing mini presentations on that, just so they could learn more a little bit about the research behind certain aspects of the course. And I think that's a great idea. Since we're talking about OASIS, let's talk about a different type of database that you have created, Caitlin, which is the collective wisdom. And as far as I know, I feel like there are a couple of pieces out there. I read about 3 or 4 of them.
That's all there are right now.
That's all there is. Okay, so I read them all. So I read all the collective wisdom, basically.
It's in its first year.
I feel like Socrates now, but there was one piece that really caught my eye, of course, because it has the word grammar in it. And I feel like teachers are obsessed with grammar. I think everyone is obsessed with grammar. And the piece was called To Teach Grammar or Not to Teach Grammar. And by the way, love the name. Love the name because that's actually not the question. And from what I remember, the article was basically just simply challenging this obsession that we have with dichotomies, with binaries, implicit versus explicit, communication versus form, PPP versus TBLT. And I feel like your main thesis with Matt, I think you and Matt write this. We're going to get Matt on the podcast too, just so you know. He's going to come soon. But I think what you both argued is that meaningful learning experiences require both. All these meaningful learning experiences require both. So the question I have for you, and this is something that Andrew and I keep coming back to, and in our own teaching context, in our own environment, with teachers everywhere, is why do you think we as an industry, as a field, why do we keep getting stuck in these grammar wars?
The why. If I'm being cynical, I would probably say money, because that's the part of language that's really easy to package and present in
it's the
a textbook,
right?
in a graded reader. And I also think oftentimes you teach languages how you learn languages. You have an expectation for what happens in a classroom. So I think it becomes self-perpetuating a little bit. But not only is grammar a comparably easy thing to document and teach explicitly, which is how science is taught, biology is taught. It is important. It's how we make meaning. But when it's presented in isolated, kind of discrete ways in textbooks, that is not what students get. And as a language learner, I had no idea that verbs could change at the ends and that would mean something else. That's how it was presented to me at the time. So I just thought they're all different words that were not connected at all. And so I think grammar is really important, and that's why it's something that keeps coming back. But I think it's often been villainized, when in reality, diving into what we mean when we say teach grammar is what is more important, and realizing that you can't not teach grammar. Like,
No.
you're going to do it. So instead of hiding that you do it or not thinking critically about the fact that you are doing it, I think it's much more interesting. I think feels better because you don't have to falsely decide that you are someone who does, but it feels better to talk about how you're doing it and why you're doing it in certain ways.
Yeah.
And then I think that creates space for the types of questions and sharing that help.
I think that's the most important thing, is just it's not about whether or not we're teaching grammar, it's just how we're teaching grammar. Because I feel, as you mentioned in your piece, that there's got to be some sort of balance. We need to strike a balance for how we do this. Like, basically, you got to teach grammar, but you have to make sure that grammar is something, as you described, and again, we've had Scott Thornberry here, emergentist, that this language has to emerge from meaningful communication, right? So the communication is at the forefront, and then the grammar will naturally follow suit, because you're going to help them say what they need to say based on those, on what they were trying to say. So focus on form and focus on meaning working together. But since you are a researcher, I need to ask, what does research, especially from a more cognitive interactionist point of view, what does it tell us about balancing communication and attention to form?
I think this is where I can make the nice connection to TBLT, because I see that as a pedagogical approach that has come out of cognitive interactionist thoughts and perspectives on SLA. And from a TBLT perspective, grammar should be taught as it's needed to do whatever you're trying to do. So in the case of TBLT, that's some task. Maybe it's make a dinner reservation. Maybe it's create an invitation to a graduation party. Maybe it's writing an email to a professor to ask for an extension for a project. What are the grammatical forms that are task essential? What needs to be in that task for that task to be successfully done? And then focus on that. And I think by keeping task as the primary unit of analysis, so the curriculums are sequenced around task, not irregular past tense verbs. Forms will come up, but they'll come up when they matter, and then give so much more context to what they're doing to serve the communicative functions.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like for such a long time, we're still doing things the other way around. We're like, here's all this grammar, and then we give students a little task or something to do where they actually have to use all the language that they've learned, and they still resort to using the most simplistic or most rudimentary way of saying certain things. And I feel like Andrew is going to relate to that, because what I find specifically now, I'm teaching a class, a college class, that it requires a little bit of, it's more content than it is language now. And even a class like that, I refuse to teach information first, and I'm giving them tasks. And then from the tasks, I can give them some of the information, and we do the task again. Which brings me to the question, because I think one of the things a lot of teachers have a hard time understanding, and myself included for a very long time, not as much anymore because we have these conversations with you and other researchers all the time, is how does interaction, attention, feedback, how do those three help drive acquisition? So perhaps you could maybe walk us through that in a way that helps those who are still somewhat uncertain about the role of grammar and how to do things in the classroom would perhaps understand it better.
Oof, okay. Big question. Multiple questions in that one. I guess I would say, and this is something I've talked about with teachers in the past, because so often when they think of what's necessary for second language acquisition, the component that I think is widely discussed in teachers' faces is input right now. And so across the board, the teachers that I'm doing workshops and programming with, they've got input, output, interaction, feedback, less. And so I think the best place to start is this idea of feedback as something that isn't bad. It happens all the time in all your interactions. And I think oftentimes it's got an association of being like the red pen, the buzzer on the desk goes off while you're talking because you conjugated a verb wrong. But feedback from like an SLA perspective means anything that whoever you're talking with is doing that's indicating that they're following you, that they understand that they're with you, or the opposite, that what you're saying is not communicating in some way, shape, or form. And so like right now, you guys are both nodding. So that is giving me some feedback that I'm making sense.
Right.
But if you were to stop and start laughing all of a sudden, or I don't know, look like you were both sending each other chats, something would go up in me and I might start thinking, oh shoot, what did I just say? Did I say something that was directly against something they just talked about on their last episode? And so I would start revisiting what I had just said. And that is what happens with language learners as well. So if I wanted to ask about plans for the weekend, but I said that in a way that you weren't sure if I meant this weekend or the following weekend or the weekend after that, you might specifically say, oh, the weekend of the 4th, that's next weekend. Or there are a lot of different ways to give feedback, and more explicit ways give learners the piece of language they didn't have, and more implicit ways just point out that something wasn't successful in what was communicated. So feedback can help. It helps people make sure they're on the same page. And for teachers, I think we can be a little bit sneaky and strategic in our feedback. And because as teachers, oftentimes we understand what our learners are saying all the time, no matter how it comes out.
Yes.
But sometimes I found myself having to pretend like I didn't understand, genuinely, not in a condescending way. So I could then deliver feedback to direct their attention using the sort of natural ways that people do in conversation to something that didn't communicate, that I wanted to see if they could go back and repair and notice themselves. And if they didn't, that's a great thing for me to notice and bring up later. So I think feedback as a tool to help direct learners' attention, because we don't know what learners are paying attention to a lot of the time.
Yes.
We could be delivering a lesson to 20 students and 5 could be thinking about ponies and the other 5 could be thinking about what's for lunch. And you just don't know. And so I think feedback can help do that. But feedback in a vacuum feels very punitive often. So the feedback's got to happen in interaction, where it usually happens in any sort of communicative interaction. And that's the way we can keep a focus on meaning, so learners don't lose sight of the form meaning connections. That is the end goal anyway, that they could use the target language to do what they want to do with it, which is, make friends and explore new places and get jobs.
To me, that is my biggest takeaway from that, is what you're describing shifts, if we're teachers, it shifts the goal or the outcome of the lesson to a communicative goal or outcome and away from a grammatical feature. So if a teacher says to themselves, at the end of this class, you'll be able to A, use the past simple, or B, talk about the highlights of your summer vacation with your group. That shifts I think that's really helpful for all of us teaching, to not just, okay, past simple will come up most likely. If it doesn't, there's a problem. If you're talking about your summer vacation, which is over. But what my evaluation of my lesson isn't about how many irregular verbs they've conjugated, to use your example. It's about can we all understand the highlights of their vacation? I think that's really important.
And I think it's tricky because the teacher has to do both. The teacher has to hold the communicative goal in their mind, but they also need to be very aware of the linguistic forms that are needed to achieve that communicative goal, so they can provide feedback appropriately, and so they don't overface their student with the task or any of the pre-task activities that might come up. So it's hard because on the one hand, you're telling the teacher, like, you're not teaching the past tense. But on the other hand, they have to know that, and they know that the past tense will come up, and likely some students will get it. But that's a nice
Which
surprise.
leads to,
but
if I can jump in just really quick, because it leads to a really natural question, I think. Because we usually talk about cognitive load for students, for learners. both this cognitive load for teachers too, in this sense. We talked to a colleague of yours, Laura Brofomsky, a while ago on our podcast, and she, I think, if I remember correctly, her dissertation was on if task-based learning or TBLT is an approach that novice teachers or new teachers are capable of implementing. Her argument is emphatically yes, no problem. I think there's an argument if we wait too long, then perhaps it's harder to ingrain in our practice. Where do you fall in? Because there's clearly challenges with how many balls in the air are we juggling as a teacher, no matter our experience level. Should this be something that we train new teachers on?
I think yes. And not just because Lara is my advisor.
Not biased at all.
I think yes, and that's the reason she's my advisor. No, but I think any and all teachers can make changes to their pedagogy. But I find that what motivates the change in pedagogy doesn't come from the head, it comes from the heart. And so that is difficult for research because research is very cerebral. But you've got to make it resonate. And I think for so many researchers, actually, this is interesting, in like the research practice interface and the scholarship concerns of that, historically, it's been more focused on teacher perspectives. More recently, some scholars have been looking at researcher perspectives. And this is where the stories of the researchers' own language teaching backgrounds come out, their language learning backgrounds, much like mine. And so researchers oftentimes really do have a strong emotional connection to the work that they're doing, but that kind of gets buried under this objective science thing. Circling back to the pre-service teachers, I think what's important is that teachers get to experience the type of language learning environment that they're supposed to be able to create. And so for me, I had the very fortunate experience in the first year of college of attending a workshop run by Darcy Rogers of Organic World Language, which is an independent consulting organization. And I think now this is more common, and I've heard of other organizations doing this, but at the time, it really blew my mind where she starts all the sessions of any workshop running a language circle in a language that's not English and hopefully not the primary language of the teachers in the room. And so right away, you're experiencing the methodology that she's hoping to impart firsthand. And then you not only see it's possible, but hopefully also you have a positive experience when you want to bring that to your students. And so I think TBLT makes a lot of sense, I think, but just because something makes sense doesn't mean you can do it and you can embody it. And so I think what's crucial when you're making any sort of pedagogical shift is to help teachers feel and see what they're going to try to make in their classroom. Because if they've only ever taught in a grammar-based, teacher-centered way, they don't even know what they're trying to do next. And that's really scary, especially when you're juggling the emotional demands of being a teacher and being in front of a room of students who may or may not be sympathetic to you.
This is a much needed conversation because I was talking to a student yesterday who's been in the system for a long time. And she was expressing to me how frustrated, because she's been taking language classes in a specific institution, higher education institution in Toronto. Name will remain anonymous for very specific purposes. But she was telling me yesterday how frustrated she is because she's been, I think there are 8 levels in this very specific program, Caitlyn, and she was saying to me like, Leo, I've been here since level 2 and I'm in level 8. And she's like, I feel like I've been learning the same thing over and over again. It's the same grammar structures, it's the same kind of assignments, it's just a lot of busy work. And she's like, I feel overwhelmed with information. There's way too many assignments. A lot of things for me to remember. And she said to me, I just don't feel like I've improved that much. And then you mentioned this idea of feedback, attention, interaction, and how teachers, and I think you talked about this idea of teaching with the heart. And I started thinking for some reason of a pedagogy of the heart. And then Andrew was talking about the evaluation of a lesson, and everything started connecting here. So I don't know if it's a question, but you said that it's important for teachers to eventually change their practice. But I find that if you've been in this system for way too long, if you've been doing this for 10, 15 years, and you've been teaching a certain way I find that it becomes really difficult for a lot of these practitioners to change the way they look at language, the way they teach language. And I feel like for some reason, and again, I'm not trying to point fingers here or anything, but I feel like a lot of us seem to be very out of touch with what's happening in the classroom with the students, who honestly, the students have changed, the world has changed, but I feel like the way we teach languages hasn't. Which leads me to the piece that you wrote about what our rubrics reveal. Rubrics, again, another collective wisdom article. And there was something that you wrote there, Caitlyn, that really stuck with me, that rubrics are where we put our values into what we think is important for our students. And then this is how I connected to the pedagogy of the heart. And that to me is a very powerful idea. So I think the question I have then is, what made you start looking at assessment as a reflection of teacher values?
So that, I think what you actually said right there is something that our researcher had brought up, Dr. Meg Monty, and she is the expert in language assessment and program evaluation, who was bringing her perspectives to the conversation. And the way that column works is that we get ideas for topics based on teacher networks and what teachers want to talk about and hear different perspectives on. And so assessment, very large topic. It's come up, it's been flagged for us a couple times. We've got just like a running Google form where people can leave their ideas and share if they'd want to be involved. But I think rubrics, again, get a bad rap. And I'm pausing in part because I'm not an assessment person in my own research. So I've been so fortunate to work at the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown. And I've learned so much. But I think from a teacher background, I always hated assessment and I never liked rubrics. And I didn't understand their full value and potential because it always seemed like something extra that had to be done at the end of a unit to show that I was walking lockstep with all the other instructors that taught Spanish too. And we may or may not have been walking in lockstep, which added a whole nother layer of complications to the assessment process. But I think now more than ever, as language programs, at least in the US, our enrollment is down, programs are getting smaller, cutting languages, cutting positions, closing entirely. It's even more important to be able to show the good work that's going on. It's not enough that students feel it themselves, which for me as a teacher, that's what I care about the most. If a student feels it, that's great. But I think especially in the current climate, being able to have that data that says to stakeholders, here is what we're working on for the first half of Spanish 2, after 4 years in the program, what have you, here is why we matter, here is what we're accomplishing. That, to me, is immensely important. And rubrics are one of the puzzle pieces of communicating that information, not only to students, but also to caretakers, to families, to colleagues. I think because, at least in the US context, world language doesn't have any associated standardized test that's involved in the graduation process at all, unlike English language arts. On the one hand, that's really nice. I think oftentimes language teachers can do whatever they want so long as they don't cause too many ripples, which is wonderful. Lots of room for experimentation. But at the same time, you've got to show what you're doing to show that it matters. And so I think being able to put that, the logical place to put that is in a rubric.
It's funny because after I read that piece, I automatically started thinking about some of the classes that I was teaching, some of the classes that I've observed. And it's amazing how when you start looking at the kind of assessments that teachers have in their classes and the kind of rubrics that they use for those assessments, they really do tell you very much about what this person, what this teacher values in the classroom. And again, we always go back to that G word, right? It always goes back to grammar. And I feel like very little of it reveals the values. Like, I want my students to develop a growth mindset. I want my students to develop confidence in communicating in different contexts and different environments. There's very little of that actually happening. And I like that idea of rubrics assessments being a reflection of what you value as a teacher, what you think it's important for students, especially because I feel that, and I think you're probably going to agree with me, I feel like a lot of the rubrics that we currently have for assignments, for assessments, they encourage compliance, they don't encourage growth. So the question then becomes, how can teachers design rubrics that encourage growth, that encourage confidence instead of just complying and just getting the work done because you have to get it done.
Absolutely. I think by rooting them in the proficiency guidelines and building a program that's based around proficiency, it's easier said than done. But if students have ways of understanding where they're at and where they want to go, I think that is really empowering. And for the colleagues I have who have really centered and brought students into conversations about their own proficiency journeys, you've got students, it sounds like it couldn't be real, but like you've got middle schoolers who are asking for things like, did I connect my sentences this time? Am I going to get intermediate low? Or am I still novice high? And they're not asking like, why didn't I get the 2 points? Why am I not at 100? They're saying, did I connect my sentences enough? What other connectors could I use? And so I think bringing students, I think designing rubrics around your proficiency goals for your program, I think is a way of making them a positive, empowering tool instead of something that's punitive. Yeah.
I think that's because it's mostly punitive. And I think, Andrew, you're probably going to agree with me. I feel like that's one of the main reasons why a lot of students cheat sometimes, because they just want to. Even today, as I was talking to this group of students, they have all told me, Leo, we don't see the point of a lot of the assessments that we're given. So we just they said to me, they're like, we use ChatGPT in this class because we don't see the point of the assessments. Then I asked them, like, do you use them in my class? And they're like, no, because you make the assessments somewhat relevant to what we need, to our lives. And we feel like we're more, I think the word that they use is, it's more meaningful. I think we go back to like meaningful learning experiences. I think learning a language, learning languages in general, they should be transformative, meaningful experiences. And you talked also about reliability, balancing reliability with humanity. And there's a constant tension between being consistent and being compassionate. How do we get that balance? How do we achieve that?
I think that can get especially tricky in a language classroom where it's natural that students will progress at different rates. That's something that TBLT recognizes and really encourages. From a theoretical perspective, like a higher lens, on a practical level, it gets really hard when you've got 30 kids and you can feel by month 6 that they're all going in different directions. But I think it's tricky even from a proficiency-based perspective, and even more so when you're trying to put a grade on things, because assessing and grading, I think, can be separated, even though they're often seen as one and the same. If I'm able to elicit data from a student, see that it is giving evidence that they're at an intermediate low level, that's one thing. But then what grade do I put on intermediate low? And if there might be students that spend all of Spanish 3 in intermediate low, and there might be students that manage to go up a sub-level to intermediate mid, and I can see they're both doing as much as they can. And is it fair that students are getting the same grade and one person's an intermediate low and an intermediate mid? I feel like I would have students coming to my office hours about that one. But at the other end of the spectrum, if we want to recognize that students their rate of development will be different, which research says it will be, how do we create space for that without inadvertently making some students feel like they're bad or slow or behind, and then having that reflected in their grade and in their GPA, which gets so much focus.
Yeah. It's a problem.
Yeah.
With grade focus, to a certain extent, there's no way around it. Like in universities and even in high schools. Yeah, it's important to an extent, but maybe going back to that rubric, how do we grade or assess the task, right? The outcome of this. Have you communicated your highlights of your vacation, to just extend my example? And then I guess that goes into teacher training as well, right? How can we train? Because you and I talk on the show a lot about why haven't people just done TBLT? But a lot goes into it. Like as Claudia Fernandez said, it's a Herculean change, because not only do you have to have a list of tasks that are appropriate for the group of students that probably will be in your class, but then what are the outcomes and what are the assessments, and then how do we assess the assessments from that whole framework? And it's a whole thing. One real life example of rubrics, not in a K-12 context, but I don't know how familiar you are, Caitlyn, with the TOEFL test. I'm hoping
Somewhat.
A little bit, because I'm not really that familiar with it. But ETS has announced like this drastic overhaul of the TOEFL test. And Leo was saying students have changed and we haven't changed the way that we're assessing. And TOEFL, maybe, I don't know if you think it's a positive change or not a good change, but we have a question from the audience from our friend John Healy, who just says, from your studies on rubrics, what do you make of the shift that TOEFL is making? And what do you think that tells us about how TOEFL views rubrics or views communicative competence moving forward?
Oof. I think you've got to get Dr. Meg Monty on the show to answer that question and do it justice. I haven't done research on rubrics, really. I've just been a part of facilitating lots of conversations about them, and I often feel myself drawn to the teacher perspective rather than the research perspective. But to speak broadly, I think to standardized tests trying to bring in more real-world tasks into their assessments, I think that's great. I think it's much better that now students are being asked to write an email or write a cover letter or make a video imagining it was going to a future employer than doing a reading passage about something that's literature based, whether or not they have a background in literature, and then doing a bunch of multiple choice comprehension questions.
Yes.
I think that's a great shift, but I think the challenge then is, are the years of instruction students are receiving prior to that assessment preparing them for success in that format? And this is where I think assessment and standardized tests are so important, because oftentimes that's what students and stakeholders prioritize. So if those can change, they've forced change from the top down. But I think you need both. I think you need assessments. If you're imagining it like assessments are at the end, which problematic, but imagine that they're just at the end and that's what you're working towards. If those can change radically, teachers will have to start teaching to the test differently. And I don't think you ever want to say teach to the test, but if the test is a proficiency-oriented test and students are providing spontaneous spoken or written language about a real-world situation that they then have to navigate, to put myself on the limb as a teacher, I would be comfortable teaching to that one.
That's one of the biggest changes I think I've seen, is that there's no preparation time now for the test taker, right? It used to be 15 seconds, 20 seconds, something like that. Yeah. And now it's go. It's right into it. But you're in a job interview or you're in a real life situation. They haven't launched these changes yet, so I think nobody really knows what it actually looks like. But it's interesting.
It is.
We'll see if it takes courage. I'm sure it'll get criticism because things always do these days, no matter what. But it takes courage to make such a big change for something that was clearly working. So I commend them for making a big change for sure.
Yeah, I'll be interested to hear. I'll probably hear most from my colleagues at Georgetown and fellow graduate students who've taken the TOEFL more like in upcoming years more recently, and what their experience was like with that.
Let's get back to TBLT now, because that's your area of expertise. So I wanted to pick your brain on a few things, because you've done some amazing work with task-based language teaching, specifically in the sense that you were basically analyzing K-12 curricula to see how task-based elements already exist within them. And I feel like I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about that, because I know task-based language teaching has already been implemented in certain countries. And I remember reading papers about TBLT in China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and even Japan, of all places. So like very popular in Asia. Why do you think TBLT has struggled to take root in US, in public schools there?
That's a great question. I think it's because we don't have the same sort of national curriculum or teacher education program that other countries have. And so to make a unified switch is just not, it just can't happen in the same way. Because in the US, there's so many different avenues to certification to K-12 classrooms. There's so many different teacher education programs that all have different curriculum and approaches. There's so many different ways to maintain your certificate once you already are licensed, that I think teachers in the US have just more choices of how to teach. And so I don't think maybe you'll ever see that massive movement towards one and only one approach.
And is that a good thing, Caitlyn, that they have way too many options, and maybe some of those options are definitely not really appropriate for what they're actually doing in the classroom and what they're hoping to achieve?
On the one hand, I like lots of options because there are lots of different classes of different students. So I don't think there's a one approach fits all. But on the other hand, you can mix and match from some approaches and it works quite well and it makes sense. But and you can't mix and match others as easily. So I think what I would be really interested in seeing is more support for teachers and how to think about the pedagogical choices that they make and what fits together and what has the same underlying assumptions about how languages are learned and how they should be taught, and what perhaps has different assumptions about how languages are being learned and taught that don't fit together as well. So just to briefly go back to assessment, if you're a teacher who is trying to do more TBLT, but you're working with a department that is using a textbook, and even if you don't have to do all the lessons in the textbook, you still have to give the unit exam, which is based on the grammar points in the textbook, that's a little bit incompatible. And you might have students that have a little bit of an unpleasant shock when they get to the assessment and they realize they're supposed to have all this explicit information.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, grammar features. So I think ways of supporting teachers so they already are having to make sense of all the different information they get about what research says or what research doesn't say and what graded readers to use or not use. That support in how to make sense of all the information, I think, is crucial.
And I think in the paper you mentioned that you looked at all these elements that already existed within them. But like when you look at all the curriculum documents, was there anything there that you found that was like surprising, that you're like, oh, wow, there's actually some TBLT elements here and people probably don't even know it's here.
Oh, yeah. I think you're referring to my master's thesis, which is when I looked through one public school district's middle school curriculum across Spanish, French, and Mandarin. And it was a department that was moving found a silver lining in the pandemic to really push on some curriculum work and move away from textbooks, no more textbooks, and have a bunch of teacher-created materials that were communicative and proficiency-oriented. And I think those are words that you hear more and more consistently when you're in teacher ed spaces in the U.S. is like communicative language teaching and proficiency-based. And I think both of those, I think TBLT is a communicative language teaching approach. And I think there is harmony between a proficiency-based approach to instruction and TBLT. But the department had never heard of TBLT. That was no one's intent. And I found so many tasks. Like, I found so many. And not only did I find tasks, but I also found teachers' guides for doing activities that indicated that teachers were seeing language, the process of learning a language, like a TBLT researcher would see the process of learning a language. And so I think one of the main implications of that study for me was that even if it's not happening in name, a lot of the principles of learning are alive and well in U.S. classrooms, and that can inform where task-based teacher education starts. So I think across the board, U.S. K-12 world language teachers agree that real-world language use is important and want to center meaning-making and have meaning-focused classes. So if you've got a group of teachers with you for a half-day workshop on TBLT, don't spend your time hammering that point home. Like, they already got that one. But perhaps what is more challenging is giving feedback and how feedback might fit into a task cycle. Start there. But for a researcher who is maybe less familiar with K-12 world language teachers and they don't know that, it seems crazy to maybe jump to an equally important but more like middle principle instead of starting at the beginning. But if the teachers already know that, you're not telling them any new information, and then you might both feel like you've wasted your time. So I think that work, like meeting teachers at where they're already at, is beneficial for everybody because then you can get on the same page and go faster.
It's funny because you've mentioned that there is no uniformity when it comes to teacher education in the U.S. There's no national curriculum, and that's probably perhaps one of the main reasons why task-based language teaching has struggled to take root in the U.S. But what advice, perhaps, would you give to administrators, departments, and that doesn't have to be just in the U.S., it could be in Canada, it could be in Europe, it could be in Brazil, schools, administrators, departments that want to support task-based language teaching, but at the same time, they have constraints. They're working within rigid systems. There's a lot of testing. There's standardized outcomes. Like what would be a good starting point for places that want to implement that kind of change?
Yeah, I think I would say start with just a task. Using a task in your classroom is not TBLT. TBLT is far bigger than just having a task in your classroom, because you can have a bunch of conjugation tables on the wall and then do a task. And that's not TBLT, but it still is a task. So I guess I would say explore some of the open access resources out there, like the TBLT Language Learning Task Bank or the TBLT TEA YouTube channel. Learn a little bit about what TBLT is. Find, adapt, create tasks that follow the TBLT definition of a task. Try them out in your classroom and see how it feels, see what you notice, with the hope that you notice things that excite you in your classroom. Maybe you see learners taking more risks. Maybe you see learners who are hopefully more engaged or are making comments about how meaningful class is so they don't cheat. And then hopefully that is the energy and the push to support further work and further change. Because I think you've got task-based language teaching, you've got task-supported language teaching. I think given task-supported language teaching is probably going to come first for a lot of programs that aren't ready to move whole hog as a whole program. And so you're dealing with teachers who are doing different things in their classroom but are using the same assessment. I think it's going to be task-supported language teaching first in those contexts. I think for school districts that are smaller, that have more freedom and liberty in terms of what assessments they use and what boxes they check, yeah, jump right in and do TBLT. As I'm sure you talked about with Claudia, it's a really long, arduous process that is worth it, but it takes a long time. And so I think starting with just one task at a time, just the task, and see what happens, and go from there.
You said earlier that teachers can help researchers by throwing out some ideas of what to research. So here I go. I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, because from a lot of this conversation, we have this with lots of people, and even Leo and I privately, focuses on what teachers can do, which is, of course, amazing and great, and how we can train teachers. But the administrative or department side of this conversation is also important, because maybe even more important, to not have us as teachers try to fit all our tasks into an assessment box that's not task-based. Do you have an example? Is there a case study? Or would this be new research that would need to be done of a school anywhere? Could be university, could be elementary, it doesn't matter. That has, and I don't want to say the word shift because shift is dramatic. I'll use piloted, because I think that logically that's where this would begin. Any school is not going to say, let's just throw out all the curriculum that we currently have in the garbage, in the trash, and just, no, that's not helping anybody. Is there an example of a school that's piloted a task-based, task-supported, or task-based successfully, that, as human nature is, if people see other success stories, then they'll be more open and more likely to try it?
Yeah, I think something that's exciting about a pilot is it's always successful because you're just in there to learn and see what happens. But
Touché.
I'm thinking of some work. Melissa Baralt has done some multi-site research and collaborations with programs working to move towards task-based language teaching, as has Eugene Kim, who's done similar kind of collaborative work with teachers and programs. And I'm happy to find they're larger projects, and so there are a number of studies associated with them that reflect different aspects of the process. There's one book that is by Earlham and, oh my gosh, Tolosa. I could only think of her first name. It is set in New Zealand, and it's focused on, at a national level, a task-based teacher education program, but it follows teachers using a cross-sectional approach from when they're in the classes learning about TBLT to several years after the fact. And it looks at student data, it looks at teachers' curriculum, teachers' perceptions of how things are going for them, what translated fairly easily into the classroom, what will require some more support. So I think those are great.
Fantastic.
Sources of inspiration.
Huh.
And I know this probably won't hit the air by October 24th, but the TBLT Language Learning Task Bank, which is created by Dr. Laura Grzinski-Weiss at Indiana University with support from the International Association for Task-Based Language Teaching, it hosts monthly workshops. And the workshop series this whole year are going to be practitioner centered. So it's
nice.
There in last year, for example, we had researchers coming and talking about input-based tasks or thinking about pronunciation with TBLT. But this year we've got a bunch of teachers who have tried out TBLT in their contexts and are speaking about those experiences. So the first one is October 24th with a teacher from the George School, Julian Angulo, here in the US. And they're recorded and they are available for watching afterwards, which is why I'm saying it, because you could go find it later. But I think increasingly TBLT researchers are seeing the importance of creating voices, elevating voices and stories that are already in circulation so we can see what's happening and learn from the teachers that are hard at work, trying to bring TBLT into their classrooms.
Yeah, I feel like TBLT is definitely on the rise right now, especially because, as I said to you, I feel like students have changed and they just don't want to be in a classroom where all they're being taught is one little grammar McNugget at a time. And I feel like the more we have these conversations, the more we bring researchers and people here to talk about task-based language teaching, I think the more we educate people to understand that there is something there. And I've been in language education for 25 years, and I've seen the pendulum swing in many different directions. But as someone who is a very reflective practitioner, I find that task-based language teaching does align with, I think it aligns best with how we learn languages. It aligns best on how we can develop the proficiency in a language and develop that sense of confidence that you can actually do something in the language. And I think this element of reflection is something that I've noticed in everything that you have written so far, Caitlyn. There's this widespread belief that teachers should be reflective researchers of their own classrooms. And earlier in our conversation, you talked about professional learning communities and professional learning in general. So what does good professional learning look like to you when teachers are treated that way, as active inquirers instead of passive participants?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different types of professional learning that serve different purposes. But for the type of professional learning that I think tries to connect research and practice, I think having it be sustained is key. It's not just a one-shot, 1 hour or even 6 hour event. It occurs over a period of time. I think, reflection. When I was learning how to be a language teacher myself, lots of reflections after every single class and every single lesson. And that's really stuck. But I think that's essential for learning professional development for teachers as well. I think, like anybody, teachers hold a lot of unconscious assumptions about what works or what doesn't work. And our attention is limited as well in terms of what we pay attention to. So in reflecting, we can notice what we are noticing a little bit more so we can make space to potentially notice what is not natural or instinctive for us to pay attention to. Sustained, cyclic, in the sense that it's not like you just check the box where you learn about the first methodological principle about TBLT and then you go on to the second one and then the third one. But instead, you're constantly cycling back because, at least for me in my own professional learning, when I was teaching full-time, and even as I think about my professional development as an academic and a scholar, I return to the same ideas but with new experiences and new perspectives. And so I think creating a space for that to happen for teacher education, where researchers and practitioners come together, is key as well.
Okay, so I heard sustainable, reflective, and cyclic. And since we're talking about teachers and we're talking about learning and we're talking about reflection, and we've also talked about the fact that colleges, universities, higher education institutions are suffering. We're dealing with, I feel like this is probably the most, I don't know, I haven't lived in the past, but I feel like this is probably the most difficult moment for us who work with languages. I feel like there's a lot of lack of funding, teachers who are quitting. I know in Canada specifically, we have, I don't know if you saw this, Andrew, but we have a deficit. We have a lot of schools who just don't have enough teachers. I don't know if it's the same problem in the US, but when you look at the next generation of educators, of teachers, of language teachers, what gives you hope?
Oof, that's a great question. I think probably their curiosity, to bring it back full circle. They come with classroom experiences that I didn't have from when they were in middle school and high school. They know more than I do about the affordances of technology. And I could take the time to learn them, or to learn the technology, or I could just learn from these newer generations of teachers. And so I think they bring a real curiosity, just like I did, about how can we make education work better and serve our students better. And because they're closer to that classroom than I am and than I was, I think that's what gives me hope, is that there's still people who are curious about making education better. So creating space to look into that together, instead of the more senior generations of teachers and researchers saying, all right, here's how you do it, instead of creating space to really learn from each other.
Progress is hard to see sometimes. I say that to my students a lot, right? It's always easier to see the gaps, like where you need to improve, your weaknesses, where things need to get better, which are great. But it's also good to pause and see how far you've come and what progress has been made.
Yeah. I was talking with a colleague of mine here at Georgetown who teaches Chinese, and she was saying that the level 1 Chinese classes they're much smaller, and there are fewer of them because students are coming in at a higher level. So progress, K-12, raising the bar and supporting students, and they can get farther in the years that they have in middle school and high school. So they push the universities to step up and grow their intermediate, mid through advanced levels, which is amazing.
You said your mom was a French teacher, I think you said. Speaking of progress, what would surprise her if she went back? I'm assuming she's retired. What would surprise her?
No, she's still teaching.
Never mind then. Okay, never mind then. You have a resource right there.
I do.
What has she noticed then about what progress has happened, or what has she noticed changes in how French is taught, if any, from when she started?
Oh, my mom is the coolest language teacher that ever existed. I think it's so hard after decades in the profession to stay excited and to connect with students. And I think she would say that's what keeps her energized, is like finding new ways to connect with students. And like the joy of having the connection is the same. The way it happens, that changes. I think for her, what's been really exciting is the support she's got from her district to have. They've looked at both the STAMP and the Apple assessments, and that has been really exciting and an indicator that there is groundswell from the teachers and the students and the families that they care about students' proficiency levels. I think that's been really exciting for her. I think as a French teacher, seeing other French-speaking countries represented in curriculum has been really exciting. And I think as the U.S. becomes an increasingly multilingual place, that can make our language programs increasingly rich in terms of the linguistic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds that are included. So I know she's had a lot of fun with that. I don't know, the Manie Musicale, are you familiar?
No.
No, what is that?
It's March Madness, but for French music.
Oh.
So it happens in March.
Interesting.
And it's a national, international, maybe even thing, where it's all set up. I'm not exactly sure who runs it, unfortunately, so I can't give credit where credit is due. But it's like a bracket-style music video tournament of all the hit songs that are lyrically and music video appropriate for school. And then students watch them, and they debate, and they vote until you've arrived at like the best song from that year. So in terms of using technology to connect across different schools, across the district.
Very cool.
I just
That's
Googled this, the
exciting.
March Madness Music Festival. Is that what it is?
I say it's the March Madness of French music.
Of
So, it's like
French
the
music.
basketball tournament.
It's a good,
Yes.
good analogy.
It's that, but for French videos. And there you can do that in any language. But I think it was started by a team of French instructors.
It sounds
Nice.
like we need more French teachers like your mom in Canada, because Leo didn't grow up in Canada, but his kids are going to school here and
Oh,
grew
I'm
up here.
seeing.
And I don't like to, there are some really good French teachers. I think the main problem is that, it comes from a good thing, is Canada officially is bilingual. It surprises many students when they come here that most people don't speak French. Most people
a bilingual
are
country,
not
but nobody
bilingual.
speaks the
It's
language.
legally
Yeah.
bilingual. So we take French as kids in school, which is good. Problem is, because most of the country doesn't speak French, there are teachers thrust into teaching French who probably if you sat down with them over coffee would say, I'm really not qualified to be doing this. Not their fault. But there are some really good ones, but I wish there were more, because I remember my French classes and it was very much how you're describing your Spanish classes, and it turned me off of learning languages as a kid, which is too bad.
I don't think it's changed much, Andrew, because both my kids are still in French immersion, and one of the main reasons why they are able to communicate or they have some proficiency in French is because they speak a lot of French at home with their mother. But when I look at, I'm very curious, I always ask them, like, can you guys show me what you're learning in French? And it's always the same handout with like gap fills and grammar and isolated lexes here and there. And I'm like, do you guys learn anything from this? They're like, no, we just do it, but we don't really get anything out of it. I'm sure they would benefit from a task-based language teaching curriculum there. And since we're coming to an end here, I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Caitlyn. And before we jump into the final question, the conversation we had with Claudia is still like fresh in my mind. And I remember, Andrew, you were talking about like when we were having this conversation with Claudia, one of the things she had mentioned is that we really need to have some sort of a mindset shift in order to start approaching language learning, language education from a perspective that is more aligned with what we know about how languages are better learned. Not best, better. Let's put it that way. So Caitlyn, as we come to an end, if you had to name one mindset shift that you've made in your career, perhaps something that really changed how you think, how you perceive teaching, learning, what would it be?
I'm not sure if it's a shift, but I think it's something I've become more and more intentional about, like, cultivating in my own mind, especially when I walk into like places where you've got research and practice connecting in some way, and researchers and practitioners connecting in some way. And that would be to assume best intent, assume everyone's there to try to make language learning a more positive and effective event for students. And I think it's so easy as a teacher to walk into a space and say, oh, this researcher just wants to hype up their work and tell me what to do, and they think they know what's best, but like they don't know my classroom. I've been having successful students for decades. As a researcher, assume the teacher that raises their hand and asks a question that seems to contradict what you've just said, doesn't care about what you do, just taking a beat and assuming best intent, and everyone's trying to make language learning better. And I think, like we've talked about, language education is got enough trying to make it smaller, make it less, that the people who are in name dedicated to supporting teaching and learning languages should minimally assume that they're all on the same page, even if they come from different backgrounds.
Yeah, just being more generous with our assumptions, that sometimes we just don't know enough to know that we don't know enough. And I think we assume a lot of malice sometimes. And I think when we approach life that way, it just makes everything much harder to bear, as opposed to, as you said, being more generous with our assumptions. I think it makes life easier to bear, and it makes us more tolerant, more open, and the word of our conversation today, more curious as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know there's so many times I've either been in an audience or been on a panel, and the question of grammar, a grammar-centered classroom comes up, and it's so easy to just say, why would you do that to instead of being like, no, this is what they think is best. They're trying to do what's best. And starting from there, because making changes is hard, making connections is hard. It's all hard work. So if anyone is in a space, that's probably a good sign that they want to be there.
Change is very hard. That's like human nature, right? And even just like the idea of change gets resistance from me, from you, from everybody. Leo loves to say Rome wasn't built in a day. We still don't know how many days it took to build Rome.
They're still building it, apparently.
But change in this capacity also won't happen in one day. So I love the word curious as a theme for the episode, because if you're curious about TBLT and curious about using it, if you're a teacher, if you're a learner, or you run a school, it won't happen in one day. So be curious and take it one step at a time.
Absolutely.